The waiter pulled out my chair, and before I could even sit down, I heard her voice cut through the noise of the room like a blade through silk. "She's too heavy to sit here," she said, loud enough for half the table to hear, loud enough for it to sting on purpose. My name is Grace Whitfield, and I had spent 31 years learning how to make myself smaller in rooms exactly like this one. Tonight I had promised myself it would be different. Tonight I was wrong to believe that. The restaurant was called Aveline, tucked into the top floor of a building downtown that most people in my family had only seen from the outside. Marble floors, chandeliers that looked like frozen rain, windows that stretched from ceiling to floor, showing the city lit up gold and silver below us like something from a postcard. My cousin Nathan was getting engaged, and his fiancée's family had rented the entire private dining room for the night. 22 people, one long table, and me standing at the edge of it with an invitation I almost did not open. I had debated for 3 days whether to come. My mother had called twice, telling me it would look strange if I did not show up, that people would talk. People always talked. That was the one constant in my life. Whispers following me through doorways, eyes tracking the space I took up like it was a personal offense. I told myself this dinner would be no different than any other family gathering, that I would eat quickly, smile politely, and leave before dessert. I did not expect to be humiliated before I even had the chance to unfold my napkin. The woman who spoke was named Camille Ashford, the older sister of Nathan's fiancée, and she had the kind of beauty that came with sharp edges. Glossy dark hair pulled back into a knot so tight it looked painful, a green dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a smile she wore like a weapon rather than an expression of warmth. She was seated at the head of our section of the table, surrounded by 3 of her friends who I did not know, all of them dressed like they had stepped out of a magazine spread about people who had never worked a hard day in their lives. I froze, with my hand still resting on the back of the chair the waiter had pulled out for me. The chair beside my cousin Emma, who I had specifically asked to sit near because she was the only person in this family who had ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere. "Excuse me," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "I said you're too heavy to sit here," Camille repeated, and this time she did not even bother lowering her volume. "This chair is a rental, sweetheart. Delicate legs. I would hate for it to be an incident in front of everyone." A ripple of laughter moved through her circle of friends. Not loud, not obvious, but enough. Enough for me to feel it settle into my chest like a stone. Enough for the couple across the table to glance at each other and then quickly look away, pretending they had not heard anything at all. Enough for my aunt, 3 seats down, to suddenly become very interested in her phone. I looked at Emma. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Her eyes were wide with a kind of helpless apology, the look of someone who wanted to defend me, but did not know how, or maybe did not want to risk her own place at this glittering table full of strangers, who mattered to people she was trying to impress. "I have sat in worse chairs," I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. "I will be fine." I will not lie and say the words did not shake a little on their way out. Camille's smile widened, and I understood in that moment that this was not really about the chair at all. It had never been about the chair. This was a performance for her friends, a way to remind the entire table who held power in this room and who did not. I was simply the easiest target available, soft and quiet, and unlikely to fight back. She had probably scanned the table before I even arrived, looking for exactly this kind of opportunity. I began to sit anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? Stand in the middle of a private dining room while 22 people watched me decide whether I belonged. But before I could lower myself into the chair, another voice spoke from the far end of the table. A voice that was quiet, but somehow the entire room heard it anyway. "Is there a problem here?" The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Something about the tone made every other conversation at the table stop mid-sentence, the way a room goes still right before a storm breaks. I turned toward the sound and found a man I had not noticed before, seated at the head of the table where I had assumed the eldest relative would be placed. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, with dark hair combed back neatly and a face that gave away nothing. Not friendliness, not hostility, nothing. He wore a black suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and he sat with the kind of stillness that made you feel like he had been watching the entire table long before anyone noticed him. I did not know his name yet. I did not know that within an hour, everyone in that room would know it and remember it. "No problem at all," Camille said quickly, her smile faltering just slightly. "Just making sure everyone gets settled comfortably, that's all." The man's eyes moved from Camille to me, and then down to the chair I was still hovering above, uncertain, humiliated, wishing the floor would simply open beneath me and swallow the entire evening whole. "Sit down," he said to me, and though his voice remained calm, there was something underneath it that made the request feel like it was not really a request at all. I sat. My legs were trembling, though I hoped it did not show. Emma reached under the table and squeezed my hand once, a small gesture that meant more to me in that moment than she probably realized. I did not know who the man at the head of the table was. I assumed he was some business associate of Nathan's fiancée's family, someone important enough to be given the best seat, but not important enough for anyone to have mentioned his name to me beforehand. I would learn later that his name was Damon Kessler, and that the reason this entire dinner had been arranged in the first place, the true reason behind the reserved private room, and the extravagant menu, and the nervous energy radiating off half the guests, had nothing to do with Nathan's engagement at all. For now, all I knew was that a stranger had told me to sit down, and for the first time all night, I had. The waiters began bringing out the first course, small plates of something delicate and expensive looking, and conversation slowly resumed around the table, though quieter now, more careful. Camille turned back to her friends and began speaking in a hushed voice, occasionally glancing my way with an expression I could not quite read. Embarrassment maybe, or something closer to calculation, like she was deciding whether the man at the head of the table was someone worth being afraid of. I kept my eyes on my plate, pushing the food around without much appetite, the earlier sting of Camille's words still burning somewhere behind my ribs. This was supposed to be a night about celebrating my cousin, about being part of something warm and familial for once in my life. Instead, I felt like an intruder who had been allowed to stay only because someone more powerful than the person mocking me had intervened. I did not want to need saving. I had spent years building walls specifically so that I would never again feel the way I felt right now, exposed and small, in a room full of people who thought less of me before I had said a single word. And yet here I was, grateful to a stranger for something as simple as being allowed to keep my seat. Emma leaned toward me, while the others were distracted with their food. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine," I said, which was not entirely true, but it was easier than explaining the storm of emotions moving through me. "That was completely uncalled for," Emma continued. "I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." "It's okay," I told her, though some small part of me wished it were not, wished that just once, someone in this family would stand up before a stranger had to do it for them. Across the table, I noticed the man, Damon, was no longer looking at Camille or her friends. He was watching me, briefly, before returning his attention to the conversation happening beside him, with an older man I assumed was Nathan's future father-in-law. It was not a lingering look, nothing dramatic, just a moment of quiet observation, the kind of glance that made me wonder if he had noticed more about the last few minutes than I realized. I told myself it did not matter. Strangers did not usually concern themselves with people like me beyond a passing moment of decency, and I had learned a long time ago not to build expectations out of small kindnesses. Kindness, in my experience, rarely lasted longer than the moment that created it. The first course was cleared away, and the second arrived, something with a rich sauce that smelled like rosemary and butter. The noise of the room grew again, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling in waves. I began to relax, just slightly, convincing myself the worst of the evening was behind me. I was wrong about that too, because across the table, Camille was leaning toward her friends again, whispering something with her hand half covering her mouth, and though I could not hear the words, I could see the way her eyes flicked toward me, and I understood with a sinking certainty that she was not finished. Whatever she was planning next, she intended it to be worse than the chair. I gripped my fork a little tighter, and reminded myself that I had survived every version of this cruelty before. I could survive one more night of it. I did not yet know that the man at the head of the table had other plans, Plans that would change the entire shape of the evening before dessert was even served. Plans that would make sure Camille Ashford never forgot the night she decided I was an easy target. For now, I simply ate, and waited, and tried not to notice the way my hands would not quite stop shaking. Dessert had not even arrived yet, when Camille decided to try again, and this time, she brought the entire table into it with her. "So, Grace," she said, setting down her wine glass with a delicate clink that somehow still managed to sound sharp. "Nathan tells us you work at some kind of bakery. Is that right?" "I own a bakery," I corrected her quietly. "Whitfield's, on Camden Street." "Oh, how sweet," she said, drawing out the word sweet like it was an insult wrapped in sugar. "That explains a lot, doesn't it?" A few of her friends laughed again, that same practiced, quiet laughter, designed to sting without ever being loud enough to draw real attention. I felt my face grow warm. Down the table, I caught my mother's eyes for a brief second, and she looked away just as quickly, the same way she always did, the same way she had done my entire childhood, whenever an aunt or a cousin made some comment about my weight, about the food on my plate, about whether I really needed a second helping. My mother had never once told them to stop. She simply hoped, every time, that I would learn to disappear a little more. "I have always found it strange," Camille continued, turning back to her friends, but keeping her voice loud enough to carry, "how some people just let themselves go completely. Like there's no self-control left at all. I mean, I understand genetics play a part, but at some point, don't you have to take responsibility for yourself?" "Camille," Nathan's fiancée said quietly, a warning in her tone, though it lacked any real force behind it. "What?" Camille said, feigning innocence. "I'm just having a conversation. There's nothing wrong with talking about health. This isn't the place," her sister murmured, glancing nervously toward the head of the table, toward Damon, who had gone very still, his glass of wine resting untouched in front of him. "Someone has to say it," Camille added, tapping the rim of her glass with one manicured finger. "Not to be cruel, just to be honest. Honesty is a kindness, don't you think?" "I do not think honesty and cruelty are the same thing," I said quietly, the words leaving my mouth before I had decided to speak them at all. "Oh, she's got a voice after all," one of Camille's friends said, feigning delight, clapping her hands together twice in mock celebration. I felt Emma stiffen beside me. "Camille, that's enough," she said, though her voice wavered halfway through the sentence, unsure of its own authority. "It's fine," I said, though it was not fine, had never once in my life been fine, only something I had trained myself to survive. I stared down at my plate, at the half-eaten food I no longer had any appetite for, and I felt something inside me curl inward, the way it always did in moments like this. A lifetime of comments. A lifetime of aunts measuring my plate with their eyes at every holiday dinner, of doctors who looked at my chart before they looked at my face, of strangers on the street who thought their opinions about my body were somehow owed to me simply because I existed in public with a shape they did not approve of. I had built a business from nothing. I had taught myself to bake at 16 years old in my grandmother's kitchen, using her handwritten recipes, the paper stained with butter and thyme. I had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years to open Whitfield's, had slept some nights on a cot in the back room because I could not afford both rent and flour in the same month. I had built something real, something that mattered, something that made people happy every single day, and none of that seemed to matter here, at this table, surrounded by people who had decided the only thing worth noticing about me was the space I occupied in a chair. "I actually think it's admirable," Camille said, her voice syrupy now, cruel in the way that pretends to be kind. "Running a little bakery, not everyone can have ambition, I suppose. Some people just find their lane and stay in it." Her friend beside her, a thin blonde woman I did not know the name of, snorted into her wine glass, trying to disguise it as a cough. I opened my mouth to say something, though I honestly did not know what words were going to come out, whether I would defend myself or simply excuse myself from the table entirely and never look back. But before I could speak, the voice from the head of the table cut through the room again, and this time it was not quiet at all. "Camille." Just her name, spoken flatly, but it landed like a gunshot in the sudden silence that followed. Every conversation at the table stopped. Every fork paused midair. Even the waiters near the kitchen door seemed to sense the shift in the room and hesitated before stepping forward. Damon Kessler stood up slowly from his chair at the head of the table. He was not a large man, not physically imposing in the way some people might expect from someone who could silence an entire room with a single word, but there was something in the way he carried himself, an absolute certainty, a stillness that made everyone instinctively lean back rather than forward. "Yes," Camille said, her voice suddenly much smaller than it had been a moment ago. "How many times," Damon asked, his tone calm and measured, "have you said something cruel to this woman tonight?" Camille blinked. "I don't know what you mean," she said, attempting a laugh that did not quite land. "I'll help you count," he continued. "Once about the chair, once about her weight, framed as a joke about self-control, and now, apparently, about her ambition, or the supposed lack of it, despite the fact that she owns and runs her own business." I did not know how he knew about the bakery detail unless he had been listening far more closely to the table than anyone realized, filing away every small cruelty as it happened, waiting. "I was only joking," Camille said, though her voice had lost all of its earlier confidence, thinned out now into something closer to nervous. "Was she laughing?" Damon asked, nodding toward me. The room's attention turned toward me all at once, and I felt my face burn under the weight of it. 22 pairs of eyes suddenly remembering I existed as more than a target for entertainment. I did not answer. I did not need to. My silence was answer enough. "I did not think you brought me here tonight to watch you humiliate a member of your family," Damon said, and it was only then that I understood, with a slow creeping realization, that Camille's family had specifically invited him, had built this entire evening around impressing him. He was not simply a guest. He was the reason this private dining room existed at all, the reason the menu cost more than most people's monthly wages, the reason everyone at the table had been dressed and polished and coached like children preparing for an exam. Nathan's future father-in-law, a heavy-set man named Gerald Ashford, cleared his throat nervously from his seat halfway down the table. "Damon, please," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "I'm sure my daughter didn't mean anything by it. She's had a bit too much wine, that's all." "I have watched people drink too much wine before, Gerald," Damon said, not unkindly, but without any softness either. This was not that. This was deliberate. Silence spread across the table like spilled water, seeping into every corner of the room. I glanced at Emma beside me, who had gone completely pale, her hand still resting lightly over mine beneath the table. Damon turned his attention back to me then, and for the first time all evening, I felt fully seen, not measured, not judged, simply seen. "What is your name?" he asked. "Grace," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grace Whitfield." "Grace Whitfield," he repeated, as though committing it to memory. "And you own a bakery on Camden Street." "I do," I said, unsure why my hands had started trembling again, though this time it was not entirely from fear. He nodded once, slowly, then turned his gaze back toward the rest of the table, toward Camille, whose face had drained of all its earlier smugness, toward the collection of nervous relatives and business associates who had spent the entire evening trying to impress a man they clearly did not understand at all. "Clear the table," Damon said. For a moment, nobody moved, as though the words had not fully registered. A waiter near the kitchen door took a hesitant step forward, glancing between Damon and the maitre d', uncertain whether the instruction had truly been meant for them. "I said clear the table," Damon repeated, his voice carrying an authority that made the confusion evaporate instantly. All of it. Every plate, every glass, everything. The staff moved quickly then, gathering plates half filled with expensive food, glasses still holding wine that had cost more per bottle than I made in a week of good sales at the bakery. Camille stared at the emptying table in front of her, her mouth slightly open, as though she could not quite process what was happening, as though the ground beneath her had shifted in a way she had never once imagined it could. Gerald half rose from his seat. "Damon, I don't understand. What is the meaning of this?" he said, his voice climbing toward something closer to desperation now. "The meaning," Damon said, turning to look at him directly, "is that I do not do business, and I do not spend my evenings with people who treat others this way. I had hoped this family understood that before tonight. It appears I was wrong. I watched Camille's face shift through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to fear, as the realization settled over her that whatever business arrangement her family had been hoping to secure through this elaborate dinner was very likely gone now, evaporated in the space of a few careless, cruel sentences directed at a woman she had decided did not matter. One of the waiters, a young man who could not have been more than 20, hesitated as he reached for the plate in front of me, glancing up as though asking silent permission. I nodded, and he lifted it away carefully, the last remnants of a meal I had barely touched, disappearing along with everything else on the table. Gerald sat back down slowly, his face a strange mixture of anger and fear, the anger clearly losing the battle. Beside him, his wife had gone very quiet, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the tablecloth as though it might offer some explanation for how the evening had unraveled so completely. Camille remained standing, or half-standing, caught in that awkward space between sitting back down and fleeing the room entirely. Her friends had gone silent beside her, none of them willing to meet her eyes now, none of them willing to be associated with whatever had just happened in front of a man whose name, I would later learn, was spoken in certain circles with a great deal of caution. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I simply sat very still, watching the table empty of everything except tablecloths and centerpieces, watching 24 people who had spent the entire night performing wealth and importance, suddenly reduced to stunned silence by a man who had said almost nothing until this exact moment. I did not fully understand yet what was happening, or why a stranger would go to such lengths over a few unkind comments directed at someone he had met less than an hour ago. But something in his voice, something in the absolute conviction behind his words, told me this was only the beginning of the evening, not the end of it. The room stayed silent for a long moment after the last plate had been carried away. Nothing left on the table except white linen and the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off empty wine glasses that the staff had not yet cleared. "I don't understand," Gerald finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier bluster. "Damon, we arranged this entire evening for you. The private room, the menu, everything. If there was a problem, you could have simply told me." "I did tell you," Damon said. "Just now. You were too busy calculating what this evening was going to cost you to notice." Gerald's face reddened. "I run a shipping company," he said, his voice tightening. "I have spent 6 months trying to secure a partnership with your organization. My daughter made one comment. One. And you're prepared to walk away from a deal worth millions of dollars over it." Damon walked slowly around the edge of the table as he spoke, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, the way a man might walk through a garden he was inspecting, rather than a room full of people whose entire evening he had just dismantled. "Your daughter did not make one comment," he said. "I counted 3, and I stopped counting after that because it stopped being about counting and started being about pattern. You want to know why I agreed to have dinner with your family tonight, Gerald? It was not because of the shipping routes, or the warehouses, or the numbers your people sent over last month. It was because I wanted to see how your family behaved when they thought nobody important was paying attention to the small things." Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that would help his position. "I have built my entire business on trust," Damon continued. "Not paperwork, not contracts, though those matter too. Trust. I need to know that the people I work with will not turn on someone weaker than them the moment they think it benefits them, or entertains them, or simply because they can. Tonight, I watched your daughter humiliate a woman she had never met, over her weight, over her career, over the simple fact that she took up a seat at this table. And I watched almost everyone else in this room stay silent while it happened." His eyes moved slowly around the table then, settling briefly on face after face, on my mother, who flinched and looked away, on Nathan, who stared down at his hands, on the various aunts and cousins who had spent the evening either laughing quietly along with Camille or pretending very hard not to notice anything at all. "That tells me everything I need to know about doing business with this family," Damon said. "You cannot be serious about this," Gerald said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "This is a business dinner. Family members say foolish things at family dinners all the time. Surely you have relatives who have embarrassed you before. I do, Damon said evenly, and I have removed every one of them from my life who behaved the way your daughter behaved tonight. Blood does not excuse cruelty, Gerald. It never has. Not for me. A woman near the far end of the table, an aunt I did not recognize, whispered something to the man beside her, and he shook his head slightly, a silent warning to stay quiet. The entire room had the feeling of a held breath, nobody quite willing to exhale, until they understood which direction this was going to break. Damon, please, Gerald said, standing fully now, his voice cracking slightly with desperation. This deal means everything to my company. My employees, their families, they depend on this. I'm asking you, please reconsider. Damon paused, considering him for a long moment. I am not interested in punishing your employees for your daughter's cruelty, he said finally. That would make me no better than the person I am currently disappointed in. But understand this clearly, Gerald. Whatever arrangement we eventually reach, and I have not yet decided whether there will be one, will not be decided tonight, and it will not be decided in this room. He turned then, his eyes finding Camille, who had finally sat back down, though her posture had lost all of its earlier confidence, shoulders curled inward, eyes fixed somewhere on the empty tablecloth in front of her. Camille? He said. She looked up at him, and for the first time all evening, I saw something like genuine fear in her expression, the realization settling over her that whatever power she had assumed came with wealth and beauty, and a sharp tongue, meant absolutely nothing in this room, in front of this man. You will apologize to Grace, Damon said, not because I am telling you to, though I am, but because it is the right thing to do, and because I suspect you have never once in your life had to do the right thing simply because it was right, rather than because someone with more power than you forced the issue. Camille's jaw tightened. I felt every eye at the table shift toward me, and I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to make this easier for everyone, by simply accepting a hollow apology and letting the evening move on. But something had changed in me over the last few minutes, something small but real, a spine I did not know I still had access to. I don't want an apology she doesn't mean, I said quietly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Damon turned to look at me, something flickering across his expression that might have been approval, though it was gone too quickly for me to be certain. Then what do you want? He asked. I considered the question carefully. 22 people were watching me now, waiting, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel small beneath their attention. I felt, strangely, powerful. I want her to understand that the next person she does this to might not have someone at the table willing to stand up for them, I said. I want her to understand what it actually costs, every single time, even when there isn't a stranger nearby to witness it. Damon nodded slowly, then looked back at Camille. Well, he said, you heard her. Camille's eyes filled with tears that seemed more about wounded pride than genuine remorse, but she nodded anyway, her voice small when she finally spoke. I'm sorry, Grace, she said. I shouldn't have said any of that. I did not respond right away. I let the silence stretch, let her sit in the discomfort of it, the way I had been forced to sit in the discomfort of her cruelty just 20 minutes earlier. Then I simply nodded once, accepting the apology without pretending it had erased anything. The staff began quietly resetting the table then, new plates, fresh glasses, the careful choreography of people trying to restore some sense of normalcy to a room that had just witnessed something none of them would soon forget. Damon returned to his seat at the head of the table, though this time, before sitting, he paused beside my chair. Would you mind if I sat here instead? He asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside me that had been intended for one of Camille's friends, who now seemed to have quietly relocated herself 3 seats further down the table, without anyone needing to ask. I would not mind, I said, still trying to understand what exactly was happening, why a man capable of silencing an entire room with a single sentence would choose to sit beside the person everyone else had spent the evening trying to make invisible. He sat, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the rest of the table slowly returning to careful, quiet conversation around us, everyone clearly still shaken, still uncertain of the ground beneath their feet. I want to apologize, Damon said finally, his voice lower now, meant only for me. For what? I asked. You didn't do anything wrong. I invited myself into a night that was supposed to be about your cousin's engagement, and I turned it into something else entirely, he said. That was not my intention when I walked in tonight. I only meant to observe, to see how this family operated before agreeing to anything with them. I did not expect to intervene the way I did. I'm glad you did, I said, and I meant it, though some part of me still felt strange admitting that a stranger's protection had meant more to me in that single moment than years of silence from my own family. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable in the way it had been all evening, though something about it felt different now, softer somehow, more curious. Tell me about the bakery, he said. I blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in subject. Whitfield's, I said. It's small. Just me and 2 part-time employees. We open at 5 in the morning and close at 3 in the afternoon most days. I make everything from scratch. The bread, the pastries, even the jams we use for the tarts. That sounds like a great deal of work for one person, he said. It is, I admitted, but it's mine. Every recipe, every decision, every small success. I built it from nothing, and some days that still feels unbelievable to me. Why baking? He asked, and something about the genuine curiosity in his voice made me want to answer honestly, rather than giving the polished version I usually offered to people who asked out of politeness, rather than real interest. My grandmother taught me, I said. I used to spend summers at her house when I was young, and she would let me help her in the kitchen, even though I was probably more mess than help in those early years. She used to say that baking was the one place in the world where careful attention always paid off, where you could not rush the process or fake your way through it. Flour and butter and time do not care about excuses. They only care about whether you did the work correctly. That sounds like a philosophy worth building a life around, Damon said. Can I ask you something? I said, feeling a small surge of boldness I did not entirely recognize in myself. Of course, he said. Why did it matter so much to you? I asked. What happened tonight? You don't know me. You had no reason to involve yourself the way you did. He considered the question for a long moment before answering, his fingers turning the stem of his wineglass slowly, though he did not drink from it. When I was young, he said, my mother worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over our heads. She cleaned offices at night and worked a register during the day. She was heavier than most of the women in our neighborhood, and people were not kind about it. Not the other mothers, not even some of the men she worked for. I watched her absorb comment after comment for years, always with a smile, always pretending it did not touch her, because she believed that was the price of surviving in a world that judged her before it ever knew her. She died believing she had to be smaller, quieter, less visible than she deserved to be. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the power to stop that kind of cruelty in front of me, I would use it. Tonight, I had that power, and I used it. I did not know what to say to that. The story had come out of him plainly, without any obvious performance of grief, but I could hear the weight underneath it, the years of carrying something he rarely spoke about. I'm sorry, I said quietly, about your mother. Thank you, he said. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the kindest people in any room are usually the ones everyone else overlooks. I felt something warm move through my chest at that, an unfamiliar feeling after an evening that had begun with such deliberate cruelty. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and wondered how a man who had just dismantled an entire evening in defense of a stranger's dignity could also speak so gently about something as simple as bread. I did not know yet who he truly was, what world he came from, what the whispers around the table meant when they referred to him with such careful respect. I only knew that for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone was looking at me like I was worth paying attention to, and not because of anything I had done to earn it, but simply because I existed, and deserved basic decency the same as anyone else at that table. Down the table, Nathan finally worked up the courage to look at me directly for the first time since the whole scene had unfolded. I'm sorry, Grace, he said, loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough not to draw the rest of the table's attention. I should have said something the moment Camille opened her mouth. I've known her behavior for years and I still didn't stop it. You didn't cause it, I said, but you're right, that you could have stopped it sooner. He nodded, accepting the honesty without flinching from it. which was more than I expected from him. Emma reached over and squeezed my hand again under the table, a small, silent gesture of solidarity that meant more than any spoken apology could have. The waiters brought out dessert eventually, small glass dishes of something layered and delicate, though I noticed most of the table barely touched it, still too rattled by the last half hour to fully return to the rhythm of the evening. Camille sat quietly beside her sister, her earlier confidence entirely gone, occasionally glancing toward Damon and me with an expression I could not quite name, something between resentment and fear. I did not gloat over her discomfort, though I would be lying if I said no part of me noticed it, or that the noticing did not feel at least a little bit like justice finally arriving after years of swallowing similar cruelty and silence. I simply focused on my dessert, on the quiet conversation continuing beside me, on the strange and unexpected warmth of being truly seen by someone for the first time in longer than I could remember. The rest of the dinner continued around us, quieter now, more careful, the kind of forced politeness that follows any storm. But something had shifted in the room, and everyone at that table knew it. Grace Whitfield was no longer invisible, and whatever the rest of this night held, I understood that it would not be forgotten easily, not by Camille, not by Gerald, and certainly not by me. 3 days after the dinner, I was standing behind the counter at Whitfield's, flour dusted across my apron, when the bell above the door rang and Damon Kessler walked in. I nearly dropped the tray of croissants I was holding. He looked entirely different in the daylight, dressed simply in a dark jacket rather than the tailored suit from the restaurant, and yet he carried the same unmistakable stillness, the same quiet weight that made the small bakery feel suddenly smaller around him. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, setting the tray down carefully on the counter. "I wanted to see the place you told me about," he said, glancing around at the shelves of bread, the glass case of pastries, the worn wooden tables near the window, where 2 regulars sat sipping coffee, oblivious to who had just walked through the door. "It's not much," I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious in a way I had not expected. "It's exactly what you described," he said, careful, built with attention, I can tell. I felt heat rise in my cheeks and busied myself rearranging pastries that did not need rearranging. "What can I get you?" I asked, falling back on the familiar rhythm of the counter, because I did not quite know how to navigate this unexpected version of our conversation. "Whatever you think I should try," he said. I made him a cup of coffee and set aside one of the almond croissants I had finished that morning, the ones I was most proud of, the recipe I had spent months perfecting until the layers came out exactly right. He took a bite, and for a moment his careful expression softened into something genuinely surprised. "This is excellent," he said. "Thank you," I said, unable to keep a small smile from forming. We talked for nearly an hour that morning, longer than either of us probably intended. He told me about his childhood in a neighborhood not far from where my own bakery now stood, about the years he had spent building his organization from almost nothing, about the careful, deliberate way he had learned to read people, a skill that had likely saved his life more than once, in a world I understood very little about. I did not ask too many direct questions about the exact nature of his business. Some part of me understood that certain answers were better left unspoken, that the whispers I had heard about him at the dinner, the careful respect bordering on fear in the way people said his name, were probably rooted in something I did not need to fully understand in order to know that he had treated me, personally, with more decency in one evening than most of my own family had managed in years. I told him about my grandmother again, about the years after she passed when I nearly gave up on the idea of ever opening my own place, about the bank loan that had almost fallen through twice before finally coming together, about the early mornings and late nights that had built Whitfield's brick by brick, recipe by recipe. He asked about the recipes too, wanted to know how I decided what to bake each morning, whether I ever experimented with new combinations, or stayed loyal to the classics my grandmother had taught me. I found myself talking more freely than I had in years, explaining the way a good laminated dough required patience across 3 full days, the folding and resting and folding again, how rushing any part of the process would ruin the final result, no matter how skilled the baker was. "That sounds like it requires a great deal of trust in the process," he said, "even when you can't see the results yet." "That's exactly it," I said, surprised that he had understood so quickly something that had taken me years to learn myself. You have to trust that the work you're doing now will matter later, even when there's nothing to show for it yet. He nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup once on the counter. I think I understand that better than most people realize, he said. Building anything worthwhile takes the same kind of patience, whether it's bread or a business or anything else. You did all of that alone, he said. Not quite a question. Mostly, I said. My family was never particularly encouraging. They thought I should find something more practical, something with better hours, better pay, less risk. But you did it anyway, he said. I did it anyway, I agreed. It was the only thing I had ever wanted badly enough to fight for. He looked at me for a long moment then, something in his expression that I could not quite name, though it made my chest feel strangely warm. I would like to see you again, he said finally, direct in the way he seemed to approach everything. Not for business. Simply because I would like to know you better. I did not answer right away, uncertain of how to respond to something so plainly stated after a lifetime of people either overlooking me entirely or treating my presence as something to be tolerated rather than sought out. I would like that too, I said finally, and I meant it, though some old fearful part of me still waited for the moment he would change his mind, the way so many people before him eventually had. Over the following weeks, he visited the bakery often, sometimes staying for an hour, sometimes simply stopping by long enough for a coffee and a few quiet minutes, before disappearing back into whatever business occupied the rest of his day. I learned that he was patient in a way I had not expected, that he listened more than he spoke, that beneath the careful stillness he carried in public, there was a surprising gentleness he rarely showed to anyone. News of what happened at the dinner had apparently traveled through my extended family faster than I expected. My mother called nearly a week later, her voice unusually careful. I heard about what happened at Nathan's engagement dinner, she said. Camille's mother mentioned it to your Aunt Linda. And what exactly did you hear? I asked, unable to keep a slight edge out of my voice. That some important man defended you, she said, that he made quite a scene. He didn't make a scene, I said. He simply refused to sit quietly while your family humiliated me the same way you all have my entire life. My mother was silent for a long moment. I'm sorry, Grace, she finally said, and I could hear something genuine underneath the words, though years of silence were not undone by a single apology over the phone. You've been sorry before, I said quietly, but you never once said anything when it was happening. Not when I was 12 and Aunt Linda commented on my portions at Thanksgiving, not when I was 16 and Camille's own mother suggested I skip dessert in front of everyone. Not once, in 31 years, did you ever tell any of them to stop. I didn't know how, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. I was scared of upsetting the family. I told myself staying quiet was easier for everyone. It was never easier for me, I said. I know that now, she said. I'm asking you to give me the chance to do better. There were other things too, she added quietly. Things I never told you because I didn't know how. When your father left, I was so afraid of losing anyone else that mattered to me that I stopped standing up for anything, not just for you. I let my sisters say whatever they wanted at every gathering because I couldn't bear the thought of being excluded from the family the way you always seemed to be. I told myself it was survival. I understand now that it was cowardice, and that you paid the price for it far more than I ever did. I let that sit for a moment, the honesty in it more than I had expected from her, more than she had ever offered me before. That doesn't undo anything, I said finally. I know, she said. I'm not asking it to. I'm just asking you to know that I see it now, clearly, in a way I never let myself see it before. I did not have an answer for her that day, not one I felt ready to give. Some wounds do not close simply because someone finally acknowledges them, but I did not close the door entirely either. I told her I needed time, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she did not push back, did not try to rush me toward forgiveness before I was ready to offer it. Meanwhile, Camille reached out once, through a message sent to my bakery's online page, rather than anything more direct. A short note saying she had been thinking about that night and wanted to apologize properly, in person, if I was willing. I did not respond right away. I thought about it for several days before finally agreeing to meet her, Not because I owed her anything, but because some part of me wanted to see, with my own eyes, whether the apology at the dinner had meant anything at all, or whether it had simply been fear of Damon's disapproval speaking through her. She came to the bakery on a slow Tuesday afternoon, dressed far more plainly than I had seen her before. None of the sharp glamour from the dinner. Just a woman who looked, for the first time since I had met her, genuinely uncertain of herself. "I've been horrible to people my whole life," she admitted, sitting across from me at one of the small tables near the window. "Not just you. I grew up in a house where cruelty was currency, where the sharpest tongue at the table won whatever argument was happening. I never stopped to think about what it actually cost the people on the other end of it, not until that night." "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully, still uncertain how much of it to believe. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she continued. "I just wanted you to know that what happened that night actually changed something in me. I've been seeing a therapist since then, if that means anything." "It means something," I said, and I found that I actually meant it, that some small part of the anger I had been carrying since that night had begun, slowly, to loosen its grip. "Can I ask you something?" Camille said, before standing to leave. "Of course," I said. "Did it feel good?" she asked, watching him do that to us that night. I considered the question honestly before answering. "Not exactly good," I said. "It felt like relief, mostly. Like something I had been holding for years finally had somewhere to go. I didn't enjoy watching you be humiliated, if that's what you're asking. I just finally understood that I didn't have to accept it anymore." She nodded slowly, something like understanding crossing her face for the first time since I had known her. "I think I'm going to remember that for a long time," she said. "Not the humiliation, the part about not having to accept it. That's probably the only part worth remembering," I said. She left a small tip in the jar by the register before she went, and though it was a small gesture, it felt like the first genuine thing she had done in my presence since the night we met. We did not become friends that day, and I did not expect that we ever fully would, but something had shifted between us, a door left slightly open rather than permanently closed, and that felt like enough for now. The weeks continued, and Damon remained a steady, patient presence in my life, never pushing, never rushing, simply showing up with the same quiet consistency he had shown at the dinner, the kind of consistency I had never once experienced from anyone who claimed to care about me before. I found myself looking forward to his visits, more than I wanted to admit, found myself smiling more easily, standing a little straighter, taking up space without the old instinct to apologize for it. One evening, as the bakery was closing, and the last of the daylight was fading through the front windows, he asked me to have dinner with him properly, not at the bakery, not surrounded by family or business associates, but simply the two of us, at a small restaurant across town that he promised would be nothing like the evening we had first met at. "I would like that," I said, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice at all, no old fear waiting beneath the words, just a quiet, steady certainty that after 31 years of shrinking myself to fit into rooms that never wanted me there in the first place, I had finally found someone who wanted me to take up exactly as much space as I needed, and not 1 inch less. 6 months after the night Camille Ashford told me I was too heavy to sit at a table, I found myself standing in front of a full-length mirror in my apartment, smoothing down the front of a deep blue dress, preparing for another dinner entirely. This one was different in every way that mattered. Nathan and his fiancée had finally set a date for their wedding, and this time, when the invitation arrived, my name was not simply included on a list of distant relatives expected to attend out of obligation. It arrived with a handwritten note from Nathan himself, an apology folded into an invitation, asking if I would consider being part of the ceremony, not as an afterthought, but as someone who mattered to him. I had not expected to say yes so easily, but something had shifted in my family over the past 6 months, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. My mother had started calling more often, not just to check in out of guilt, but to actually listen when I spoke, to ask real questions about my life, and wait patiently for real answers. She had come into the bakery twice now, sitting quietly at one of the small tables while I worked, watching me build something with my own hands, something she had never once witnessed with real attention before. Emma had become something closer to a true friend rather than simply a cousin I tolerated at family gatherings. And even Camille, in her own halting, imperfect way, had reached out several more times over the months, each conversation slightly less guarded than the last. I did not know if we would ever be close, but the woman who had mocked me so cruelly that night had become someone I no longer dreaded encountering, which felt, in its own strange way, like enough progress for one lifetime. And then there was Damon. 6 months of quiet dinners, of long conversations that stretched late into the evening, of him showing up at the bakery some mornings simply to sit near the window and read while I worked, never demanding my attention, simply content to be present. I had learned more about him during those months than I think most people in his world ever knew, not the details of his business, which he kept carefully separate from our time together, but the parts of him that mattered more, his patience, his steadiness, the quiet way he made space for other people to simply exist without judgment. There had been small moments along the way that told me more about him than any grand gesture could have. The evening he noticed I was exhausted after a long day at the bakery and simply sat with me in comfortable silence rather than filling the space with conversation. The afternoon he drove 2 hours to a specialty supplier because I mentioned, only in passing, that I had been struggling to find a particular type of vanilla for a new recipe I wanted to try. The way he remembered small details from our conversations weeks later, bringing them up naturally, proving he had actually been listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He had never once, in 6 months, commented on my body, my weight, my plate at dinner, the way I moved through the world. He had simply treated me like a person worth knowing, worth listening to, worth defending when the moment called for it, and worth respecting quietly when it did not. It had taken me 31 years to understand what that kind of treatment actually felt like, and I found myself, more often than not, wondering how I had survived so long without it. The wedding took place on a warm evening in early autumn, in a garden behind an old stone building downtown, string lights woven through the trees, the air smelling faintly of late roses and fresh-cut grass. I stood near the front during the ceremony, close enough to see Nathan's face as he watched his bride walk toward him, close enough to catch my mother wiping away tears a few rows back, close enough to see Camille standing quietly beside her sister. No sharp smile on her face tonight, simply present, simply human. Damon sat toward the back of the garden, not drawing attention to himself, though I noticed several guests glance his way throughout the ceremony with the same careful respect I had witnessed at the first dinner. He caught my eye once during the vows, and offered the smallest smile, private, meant only for me, and I felt something warm settle deep in my chest. The reception that followed was held in the same garden, tables scattered beneath the string lights, a small band playing something soft and unhurried, near the edge of the dance floor. I found myself seated, this time, not at the edge of any table, not tucked away where I might be overlooked, but directly beside Damon, at a table that included my mother, Emma, and to my genuine surprise, Camille herself, who had asked Nathan quietly beforehand if she might be seated near me. "I hope that's okay," she said, when I arrived at the table and saw the seating arrangement. "I wanted the chance to actually get to know you properly, if you're willing." "I'm willing," I said, and I meant it. Dinner unfolded easily that evening, conversation flowing without the careful tension that had defined our first meeting all those months ago. Camille asked genuine questions about the bakery, about the recipes I had inherited from my grandmother, and I found myself answering without the old defensive posture I had carried into every conversation with her before. My mother laughed more freely than I had heard in years, and even Emma, usually quiet and watchful in large gatherings, seemed to relax into the warmth of the evening. At one point during the meal, my mother reached across the table and took my hand, her eyes glassy with emotion. "I am proud of you," she said quietly. Meant only for me, though I suspect the whole table heard it anyway. Not just for tonight, for everything, for the bakery, for standing up for yourself, for becoming someone I probably don't deserve to call my daughter after everything I failed to do for you growing up. "You're here now," I said, squeezing her hand back. "That counts for something." "It should count for more than something," she said, wiping quickly at her eyes before anyone else could notice. Camille, sitting across from us, had gone quiet during the exchange, watching with an expression that looked almost wistful, as though she were measuring her own relationship with her mother against what she was witnessing at our table. Later, when the conversation moved on to lighter topics, she leaned toward me during a quiet moment. "I've started saying something now. When I hear people talk about others the way I used to talk about you," she said. "It's small. It's not enough to undo anything. But I wanted you to know." "That's not small," I said. "That's exactly the kind of thing that changes a room, even when nobody notices it happening." Toward the end of the meal, as dessert plates were being cleared and the band shifted into something with a little more energy, Damon leaned toward me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, echoing, without realizing it, the same words Camille had used months earlier in the bakery. "Of course," I said. "Do you remember what you told Camille that night?" he asked. "About what you wanted from her apology." I remembered clearly. I had said I wanted her to understand what her cruelty actually cost, every time, even when there was no stranger nearby to witness it and intervene. "I remember," I said. "I've been thinking about that a great deal these past months," he said. "About how much courage it must have taken to ask for something like that, rather than simply accepting an easy apology and moving on the way most people would have. I didn't feel courageous in that moment," I admitted. "I felt terrified. I think I was more surprised than anyone that the words came out at all." "Sometimes courage looks like terror from the inside," he said. "It rarely feels the way people expect it to." I considered that for a moment, turning the thought over slowly. "I think you're right," I said. He reached into his jacket pocket then, and for a brief, strange moment, I thought he might be reaching for his phone, some business matter interrupting the warmth of the evening the way it occasionally did. Instead, he withdrew a small velvet box, and the noise of the reception around us seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. "Grace," he said, his voice steady in the way it always was, though something beneath it trembled slightly, something I had never once heard from him before. "I know this is not the traditional way these things happen, and I know we have only known each other 6 months, though it feels, to me, like a great deal longer than that. I have spent most of my life believing that the world simply operates on power, on who commands a room and who does not. You taught me something different. You taught me that the people worth building a life with are not the ones who never need defending, but the ones who deserve to be defended, and who, given the chance, would do exactly the same for anyone else at the table." I felt my eyes fill with tears, the warm noise of the reception around us fading into something distant and unimportant. "I am not a simple man," he continued. "My life comes with complications I cannot always explain, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I know, with more certainty than I have felt about almost anything, that I want you beside me, not because I need someone to protect, but because I have never once, in my entire life, met someone who makes me want to be better, simply by existing near her. Will you marry me?" The table had gone quiet around us, though I barely noticed, the entire garden narrowing down to the two of us, to the small velvet box open between us, to the steady warmth in his eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice breaking slightly on the single word. "Yes, of course, yes." The table erupted into quiet, delighted celebration, my mother's hands flying to her mouth, Emma laughing through unexpected tears, even Camille clapping softly, a genuine smile on her face that held none of the sharp edges from the night we had first met. Later that evening, as the reception wound down and guests began drifting toward the exits, I found myself standing near the edge of the garden with Damon, the string lights glowing softly above us, the last of the band's music drifting quietly through the warm autumn air. "Do you ever think about that night?" I asked. "The dinner where we met?" "Often," he said. "It is the reason I am standing here right now, asking you to spend the rest of your life with me." I thought about the version of myself who had walked into that restaurant 6 months ago, expecting to shrink herself small enough to survive one more family gathering, expecting the familiar sting of comments about her body, her weight, the space she occupied in a room that had never wanted her there. I thought about the chair I had almost not been allowed to sit in, about the table that had been cleared entirely in my defense, about the slow, difficult, beautiful process of learning that I deserved to take up exactly as much space as I needed, without apology, without shrinking, without waiting for permission from anyone. I would not change a single moment of that night. I said finally. Even the cruelty. It led me here. Damon took my hand then, his fingers warm around mine, and together we looked out over the garden, over the string lights and the last dancing couples and the quiet, contented hum of a wedding that had healed far more than the two people who had gotten married that day. I thought about all the dinners before this one, the holidays where I had learned to eat quickly and quietly, positioning myself near the edges of rooms, near exits, near anywhere I could disappear from easily if the comments started. I thought about the years spent apologizing for portions, for outfits, for simply existing in spaces that had decided, long before I ever opened my mouth, what kind of person I was allowed to be. None of that shame belonged to me anymore. I understood now that it had never truly belonged to me at all. It belonged to every person who had ever needed someone else to feel smaller in order to feel powerful themselves. I do not know exactly what the future holds, I thought, standing there in that garden, my hand held steady in his. I do not know what challenges will come with loving a man whose world is as complicated as his clearly is, or what it will mean to build a life beside someone so many people regard with quiet, careful respect. But I know this. I will never again shrink myself to fit into a chair that was never too small for me in the first place. I will never again apologize for the space I take up in any room I choose to enter. Somewhere behind us, the band began playing one final song, slow and warm, and Damon pulled me gently toward the dance floor, his hand steady at my back, guiding me not away from the space I occupied, but fully into it, exactly as I was, exactly as I deserved to be seen. They mocked me once, told me I was too heavy to sit at their table. I did not know, that night, that within 6 months, I would be sitting at a table of my own choosing, surrounded by people who had finally learned to see me clearly, beside a man who had cleared an entire room, simply because he refused to let cruelty go unanswered. I had spent 31 years believing I needed to become smaller to be loved. It took one dinner, one stranger, and one long overdue reckoning with my own family to finally understand the truth. I had never needed to shrink at all. I had simply needed someone, finally, to see me exactly as I was, and decide, without hesitation, that I was more than worth the seat.